All right, let's get into it. There's this huge conversation happening online, and it basically says that the rules of dating have been completely flipped on their head, leaving a lot of guys just totally lost. So today, we're going to break down exactly what that argument is, piece by piece, and look at why it's hitting home for so many people. And this quote right here, from a source called Philomorphosis, it really cuts right to the chase. The whole idea we're digging into today is this belief that the fundamental operating system for relationships has been rewritten, and a lot of men are walking around with an outdated manual.
So what is this fundamental shift they're all talking about? What's supposedly causing it? And what are the effects on the ground? Let's dive in and see what the source materials are actually saying.
Now, according to these sources, this isn't just some vague feeling in the air. No, the argument is that you can actually see this shift in very specific, repeating behavioral patterns that, they claim, are becoming way more common. So let's take a look at what those are.
What's really interesting here is how one source, Philomorphosis, talks about these behaviors. They're not framed as giant, obvious red flags. Instead, it's described as a kind of subtle emotional erosion. It's not about one big, dramatic event, but about 1,000 tiny cuts. You know, the constant victim narrative, arguments that are just about scoring points, not solving problems, and a friend group that just cheers on the chaos. But the most crucial point from this perspective is that last one. You just slowly realize your own peace of mind is gone.
Okay, so you have these everyday observations, right? Well, this is where it gets really fascinating because another source, a clinician named Dr. Spear, connects all of this to a specific psychological framework, cluster B personality disorders. The argument being made is that these behaviors aren't just random quirks, they're part of a well-documented clinical pattern.
And this slide really lays it all out. It shows you the direct line the sources are drawing. On the left, you've got the everyday descriptions, things like emotional chaos, and on the right, you have the clinical term that maps right onto it, like emotional instability. The point they're making is that these are basically two different languages describing the exact same thing. All right, so we've talked about behavior. But it's not just about what people do. The next piece of the puzzle, according to these sources, is decoding the actual language of modern dating, where, supposedly, what's being said and what's being meant are two totally different things.
And this quote, it just nails the whole idea. The point isn't that men aren't listening, it's that they're taking words at face value, when, from this point of view, a completely different message is being sent through subtext, tone, and action.
So check this out. Here's a kind of decoder based on what these sources are claiming. The real takeaway here isn't just the specific translations, but the logic behind them. "I'm not ready for a relationship right now" gets interpreted as a soft way of saying, "not with you." The phrase "money doesn't matter" is seen as a test for your competence and stability. And hearing "my ex means nothing to me" is flagged as a sign that, well, maybe he still does. It's all about listening for what's between the lines.
And this brings us to what is maybe the most controversial part of this whole argument, the claim that these so-called pathological traits aren't just out there, but that they're actually on the rise.
So let's start with the official number. The figure that gets cited all the time, which Dr. Spear also points to, puts the rate for cluster B disorders at 5.9% of the population. That's been the go-to statistic for a long, long time.
But, and this is a big but, one of the key sources argues that this number is seriously misleading and doesn't even come close to the real picture. So why? What are the reasons they give for why this could be a massive undercount?
Well, the case for an undercount really boils down to a few key things. First, the idea is that the rulebook for diagnosis just hasn't kept up with how culture has changed. Second, that studies tend to ignore sub-threshold cases, people who have a lot of the traits but don't quite tick every single box. A huge one is that these studies often depend on people accurately reporting on themselves, which is a big ask for a group often characterized by a lack of self-awareness. And finally, the sources claim there's this big push to relabel these behaviors as trauma, which kind of shifts the conversation away from accountability.
So if you take all of this into account, the alleged behavioral patterns, the communication disconnects, what's the end result? What is the actual experience for men in these relationships, according to these sources? Let's break that down.
And this quote just sums it all up, doesn't it? The sentiment being expressed here isn't a frustration with women as a whole. It's a very specific kind of exhaustion from feeling like you have to carry the entire emotional, financial, and logistical load of the partnership.
So this source, Philomorphosis, lays out a process they call self-erasure. It starts with compensation. You just do more, you pay more, you absorb more stress just to keep the peace. But the argument goes, this actually makes her lose respect for you, and you lose respect for yourself. So what happens next? You lower your standards. You start accepting the bare minimum as if it's a gift.
And the final stop on this train is a total loss of your own peace and drive, because all your energy is going into just managing the relationship.
All right, so after laying out all of these alleged problems, patterns, and experiences, what's the solution? What's the advice here? Well, it's actually not about trying to change the other person at all. It's about self-preservation.
The core takeaway, the big piece of advice, is to stop trying to be a fixer. Instead, the focus is on getting really, really good at recognizing these patterns early on, sticking to your own standards, and making the protection of your own mental and emotional well-being your #1 priority.
And this right here is the final word on it. It completely reframes the whole hero narrative. The message is that your purpose isn't to go on a rescue mission for someone else's emotional baggage. The way forward, according to this view, is to focus on yourself and pull yourself out of dynamics that are draining you dry.
So, where does all this leave us? You know, whether you agree with any of this or think it's completely off base, you can't deny that this conversation is huge right now. And its popularity says something important about the level of frustration people are feeling. It seems like understanding that frustration is pretty essential for anyone trying to figure out the dating world today. Which really leaves us with the big question: what does all of this chatter truly tell us about where we are right now?